My name is Celeste Rowan. I was 29 when I came home to find my own key didn't turn the way it should. It wasn't broken. It was just resisted, like the door had learned a new rhythm without me. I stood on the porch of the house I had bought with 3 years of overtime and undersleeping, listening to voices that were not mine drifting through the window I'd painted the color of afternoon light. My mother's laugh. My father's low hum of agreement to something on the television. I let myself in slowly. The way you enter a dream you're not sure is yours. The living room had been rearranged. My reading chair pushed to the corner, apologetic. A suitcase, no, 3, stacked by the staircase like they'd always belonged there. My mother turned to me first, wiping her hands on a dish towel that was mine, in a kitchen that was mine, and said, "Oh, good, you're home. We didn't want to bother you at work." Bother me. As if this, the quiet erasure of my address into ours, was a kindness. I didn't raise my voice. I never do, not at first. I asked, carefully, how long they'd been here. My father answered without looking up from the screen. "Since Tuesday. The lease on our place fell through. You have all the space, Celeste. It didn't make sense to ask and wait for you to say yes. It didn't make sense to ask." I stood in my own hallway holding my coat, like a stranger waiting to be invited to sit. There's a particular kind of disorientation in realizing that the people who raised you have decided your life is a room they're entitled to walk into. Not a request. A relocation. I said I needed a minute. I went upstairs to what used to be my office and found my desk pushed against the wall, my father's old workbench tools already claiming the surface like moss over stone. I sat on the floor because the chair wasn't mine to sit in anymore, apparently, and I thought about all the years I'd measured my worth by how much I could give without asking anything back. How proud I'd been to buy this house, to finally have 4 walls that answered only to me. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. This isn't a story about tears. It's about the particular, quiet vertigo of watching your boundaries dissolve in real time and realizing that the people testing them are the ones who taught you long ago that you weren't supposed to have any. Downstairs, my mother called up that dinner was almost ready. My dinner. Cooked in my kitchen, with groceries I hadn't bought, in a house that no longer sounded like mine. I came down eventually. I smiled, because that's what I'd always done. But something in me had started, quietly, to recalculate. 3 days later, there was a 4th voice in the house. My brother Desmond arrived on a Thursday evening with a duffel bag and the particular ease of someone who has never once doubted his welcome anywhere. He hugged me like nothing was unusual, like this wasn't the first time in 2 years he'd stood in a home of mine. "Mom said you had room," he said, already halfway up the stairs. Mom said, not asked me, said, to him, about me, as though I were a resource to be allocated rather than a person to be consulted. I stood in the doorway of my own house and felt something settle in my chest, not rage, not yet. Something colder and more patient. A kind of clarity that arrives only after enough small violations have accumulated to become undeniable. That night, I lay awake listening to 3 sets of breathing that weren't mine, 3 lives now nested inside the one I had built alone, brick by brick, invoice by invoice, sleepless night by sleepless night. I thought about the years I'd spent making myself smaller so the people around me could feel bigger. The times I'd said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. The performance of easiness I had mistaken, for so long, for love. I thought about my father's workbench sitting on my desk, my mother's dish towel in my kitchen, Desmond's duffel bag already unpacked into a closet no one had asked to use. I began, quietly, to take inventory, not of grievances, but of patterns. My mother had always favored Desmond's comfort over my consent. My father had always mistaken my patience for permission. And Desmond himself had never once, in 31 years, needed to ask for anything, because someone else had always already given it to him on his behalf. I wasn't angry at them for who they were. I was angry at myself for how long I had let their instincts about me go unquestioned. The next morning, I made coffee for 4 instead of 1, sat at my own table, and listened to my family discuss where they might put a television in the office, as though the decision had already been made without me in the room. I said nothing yet. I was still gathering myself, the way you gather your coat before stepping into whether you already know is coming. But something had shifted. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I felt like a witness, quietly documenting exactly how little my yes had ever mattered to the people I loved most. I grew up in a house where doors didn't lock, not because we trusted each other, but because privacy was treated as a kind of betrayal. My mother believed a locked door meant a secret, and secrets, to her, meant disrespect. I remembered being 14, taping a "Do Not Enter" sign to my bedroom door, and finding it torn down by evening, my mother's voice trailing behind her as she said, "This is my house too, Celeste. Everything in it is ours. Everything in it is ours." I hadn't thought about that sentence in 15 years. But standing in my own kitchen now, watching my father rearrange my spice rack into an order that made sense only to him, I heard it again, clear as if she'd just said it. This wasn't really about a lease falling through. This wasn't about generosity or family closeness. This was a pattern with a very long memory, one where my autonomy had never been treated as real, only as a temporary inconvenience to be worked around whenever it suited someone else's comfort. I found an old box that week while looking for a document I needed for work. My father's tools had displaced half my filing cabinet, and inside it were report cards, birthday cards, a photograph of Desmond's 12th birthday party held, I now remembered, on the same weekend as my college acceptance letter. No one had mentioned the acceptance letter that weekend. There had been a cake shaped like a soccer ball instead. I sat with that memory a long time. Not with anger, exactly. With recognition. The kind that rearranges everything that comes after it. That evening, my mother asked, almost absent-mindedly, whether I'd mind switching bedrooms with her and my father, since the guest room got better light in the morning. She asked it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. As if my agreement were inevitable, a formality rather than a real question. I looked at her for a long moment. "Let me think about it," I said. She blinked, surprised, not by the answer, but by the fact that there had been a pause at all. I went to bed that night with a strange, unfamiliar feeling. Not sadness, not fury. Something closer to clarity settling into bone. The sense that I'd spent 29 years mistaking my own disappearance for love, and that somewhere in that box of old photographs, a version of myself had been waiting patiently to be noticed. I am, by profession, a financial analyst. I spend my days finding the places where numbers don't tell the truth they claim to. It felt, that week, like I finally turned that same attention on my own life. I began writing things down, not as evidence for a confrontation, but for myself, the way you might keep a journal to prove to your own memory later that something really happened the way you remember it. The groceries bought with my card, without asking. The doctor's appointment my mother had scheduled using my address as their permanent residence, informing me only after the fact. The casual mention over dinner that Desmond had told his landlord he was between places and might be here a while. Here, my house, spoken of as a shared inevitability rather than a boundary that required consent. I noticed, too, the smaller things, the way my father would finish my sentences in front of guests, the way my mother would apologize on my behalf for opinions I hadn't yet had, the way Desmond would take the last of anything without checking if anyone else wanted it, because it had never once occurred to him that anyone might. None of it was violent. None of it was cruel, in any way you could point to and say, "There, that's the wound." It was smaller than that, and in some ways harder to name, a lifetime of my needs treated as negotiable and everyone else's treated as fact. I thought about calling a friend to talk it through, and then I thought better of it. This wasn't a decision I needed anyone else's permission to arrive at. That, in itself, felt like the beginning of something. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through the house after everyone had gone to bed. I stood in my own living room in the dark and looked at what my life had become in the space of 10 days. Furniture moved, mail redirected, plans made without me, my house becoming, room by room, theirs. I thought about the woman who had signed the mortgage alone, who had painted every wall the color she wanted, finally, for the first time in her life, who had believed, naively perhaps, that having a home of her own would mean having a self of her own too. I made a decision that night. Not out of anger. Out of arithmetic. The numbers, finally, had stopped adding up in anyone's favor but mine. I almost wrote them a letter. I sat at my kitchen table, reclaimed, that week, from a stack of my father's mail, and I began composing everything I wanted them to understand. About the locked doors of my childhood that were never really locked. About the acceptance letter overshadowed by a soccer ball cake. About 29 years of being generous by default and wondering, quietly, when generosity had stopped being a choice and become an assumption. I wrote 3 pages. I meant every word. Then I didn't send it. Because somewhere in the writing, I understood something important. I didn't need them to understand. I needed myself to stop waiting for them to. The letter had been, in its own way, one more attempt to earn permission for a boundary I already had every right to set without explanation. I folded the pages and put them in the box with the old photographs, the report cards, the memory of the birthday cake. Not to hide from what I felt, but because I realized the letter had been written for a version of my family that might read it and change. And some part of me, finally, at 29, understood that hope like that had cost me more than it had ever returned. The next morning, I didn't wait for the right moment. I didn't rehearse a script. I simply said, over coffee, in the kitchen that was and would again be entirely mine, I need you all to move out by the end of the week. My mother laughed first, a short, disbelieving sound. Celeste, don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'm asking for my house back. I never agreed to any of this. Not the moving in, not the moving around, not the assumption that my life was available for the taking. My father set down his coffee cup very slowly, the way people do when they're recalculating something they thought was solved. Desmond said nothing at all. He had never had to. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. 29 years of silence had given the sentence all the weight it required. The days after that were not cinematic. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations. There was, instead, a strange and heavy quiet, the sound of people packing slowly, testing whether I might change my mind if they simply delayed long enough. I didn't change my mind. My mother tried twice to reframe it. We're family, she said, as if that fact alone should override anything I might want. Family helps family. Family asks first, I told her. You didn't ask. You decided, and you expected me to accommodate the decision quietly, the way I always have. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she'd ever needed one before. My father, for his part, said very little. On his last morning in the house, he found me in the kitchen and said almost gently, I didn't think of it as taking anything from you. I thought of it as us all being together. I know, I said. And I meant it. I didn't think he'd acted with cruelty. I think he'd simply never had to consider that my house, my consent, my life, existed as something separate from the family's shared assumptions. That, in its own way, was the saddest part. Not malice. Just a lifetime of never being asked to see me as someone with a door of my own. Desmond left without much said between us. At the threshold, he paused and said, You've changed. No, I said. I've just stopped disappearing. He didn't understand that, I think. But I wasn't speaking for his understanding anymore. By Sunday evening, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in nearly 2 weeks. Not the anxious, cluttered quiet of people careful not to be noticed, but the settled quiet of a space that finally, again, belonged to only one person. I walked through each room slowly. My reading chair, back in its corner. My desk, cleared. My spice rack back in an order that made sense to no one but me, which was, I realized, exactly the point. Grief arrived a few days later, uninvited, the way it often does once the adrenaline of a decision has faded and only its consequences remain. I hadn't expected to miss the noise. I hadn't expected the silence of my own house to feel, for a few nights, like an accusation rather than a relief. I sat with that discomfort instead of running from it, because I understood, somewhere beneath the ache, that grief here wasn't proof I'd made the wrong choice. It was proof of how long I'd organized my identity around being needed, even when being needed had cost me my own shape. I called my mother once, that week, not to apologize, but to check that they'd found somewhere to stay. She was cool at first, careful, the way people are when they're deciding whether to punish you with distance. But by the end of the call, Something in her voice had softened, just slightly. Not into agreement, but into the beginning of acknowledgement. "You could have just talked to us," she said. "I did," I said. "For 2 weeks. You just weren't used to me finishing the sentence." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "Maybe we weren't." It wasn't an apology. I didn't need it to be. It was, instead, the first honest sentence either of us had said to the other in longer than I could remember, and for now that felt like enough. I spent the following weekend repainting the guest room, the one with the better morning light, not out of spite, but because I wanted, finally, to make every decision about my own home a decision made freely, not one negotiated around someone else's comfort. I chose a pale, quiet green. No one's favorite but mine. I thought, as I painted, about the version of myself who had once believed that love meant making yourself endlessly available. I understood now that what I had mistaken for love was often just fear. Fear that setting a boundary would cost me the people I loved. It hadn't. It had cost me only the version of myself who had never been allowed to have one. Months passed. The relationships didn't heal quickly, and I've stopped expecting them to heal completely. My mother calls sometimes, more careful now with her assumptions, though old habits surface occasionally, quieter versions of themselves. My father visits on weekends now and always, without fail, texts first to ask if it's a good time. It's a small thing. It means more than he probably knows. Desmond and I speak rarely. I think, in his own way, he's still working out what it meant that the sister who never said no had finally learned how. I don't regret what I did. I want to be honest about that too. This isn't a story that ends in triumphant vindication, all wrongs righted, every relationship neatly repaired. It's quieter than that, more honest than that. What I gained wasn't revenge. I never wanted anyone to suffer for what happened. I only wanted, finally, to stop disappearing inside my own life to make room for people who had never once thought to ask if there was room to spare. Some evenings now, I sit in my reading chair, back in its corner, exactly where I want it, and I look around at a house that, for the first time since I bought it, feels entirely, quietly mine. Not because I locked anyone out of my life, but because I finally learned at 29 how to lock a door and mean it, not as a wall against the people I love, but as the simple, overdue acknowledgement that I get to decide who enters, and when, and on whose terms. The light still comes in best through the guest room window in the mornings. I know that now, because I finally get to notice it for myself. That I've come to understand is what the whole story was really about. Not the suitcases. Not the locked door that didn't turn. Just a woman, finally, learning the quiet, unglamorous work of staying, fully, unapologetically, in her own life.